Hey, good morning. I'm Patricia Murphy. It's Wednesday. This is Seattle Now. It's been 5 years since Antonio Mays Jr. was shot and killed at the Capitol Hill Occupied protest in Seattle. He was a black teenager whose murder is still unsolved. Yet, as his father continues to seek answers, we've learned new information. Seattle Times investigative reporter Sydney Brownstone will tell us what she's uncovered about Antonio's murder and what it might mean for the ongoing investigation and upcoming court case. But first, let's get you caught up. State Attorney General Nick Brown says federal grant money for mental health programs in K-12 schools are shielded from cuts for now. This week, a federal judge blocked the Trump administration's attempt to cut the funding. The money was approved by Congress in 2022 after the mass school shooting in Uvalde, Texas. Washington joined 16 other states in suing to block the cuts. Washington State's unemployment benefits call center will be expanding its hours in an effort to get through the growing backlog of claims. Right now, the call center is active Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, but starting this week, it will also be open Tuesdays and Thursdays from 8 a.m. to noon. It's part of a 90-day pilot program. The department reports a spike in claims due to private sector layoffs, seasonal workers applying for benefits, and continuing claims related to the government shutdown. And this afternoon, Tacoma Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland addresses looming cuts to the WIC program. Due to the government shutdown, funding for the Women, Infants, and Children program could run out in Washington state by mid to late November. WIC provides food, baby formula, and other support for more than 200,000 women and their children in Washington state. Strickland will be joined by Tacoma Pierce County health officials to highlight resources for families who need baby formula. The press event begins at 1:15 at the Eastside Family Resource Center in Tacoma. Check back for more headlines on tonight's episode of Seattle Now. In the summer of 2020, there were nationwide Black Lives Matter protests following George Floyd's murder by police. Here in Seattle, we had the Capitol Hill Occupied protest, or CHOP. The protest ended in tragedy when a black teenager named Antonio Mays Jr. was shot and killed. His father is suing the city of Seattle over his son's death. The trial could start as soon as next week. Seattle Times reporter Sydney Brownstone has uncovered new information that contradicts the city's narrative about what happened on the last night of Antonio's life. Her story is co-reported with David Gutman at the Times and KUOW's Will James. Sydney, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me, Trish.
So CHOP was 5 years ago, but it is still part of the ongoing national conversation about Seattle. Let's give listeners a quick recap of what the Capitol Hill Occupied protest was.
The Capitol Hill Occupied protest started by accident. After George Floyd was murdered, there was this public outcry in cities across the country where people just came out during the COVID pandemic saying, enough is enough, we've had enough of police brutality. And Seattle was no different, but this turned into a flashpoint outside of the East Precinct on Capitol Hill, where for days there was this line, this standoff between East Precinct officers and protesters who had amassed outside, and the police decided to kind of stop them from passing past the precinct for fears that the protesters would somehow mess with the precinct. And police used crowd control weapons, tear gas, flashbangs on the protesters. This became so tense, and at some point, police decided to abandon their own precinct, at which point the protesters said, okay, well, we can either keep marching or we can stay here. And they decided to stay and turn the protest into an occupation rather than just a march.
Okay, so that's the genesis of CHOP. Your investigation centers on one particular CHOP protester. Who was Antonio Mays Jr. and how did he end up there?
Antonio Mays Jr. was a kid from San Diego, the area around San Diego, who had grown up with stories about the civil rights movement from his father. He was very acutely aware of his social location as a young black man in the United States, and as many teenagers do, growing his own political consciousness. So when CHOP formed, he was watching live streams from down in San Diego saying, this is the civil rights movement of my time, I want to go participate. And so he ran from home, ran up to the protests. His dad didn't know where he had gone, and he started participating in them.
Antonio Mays Jr. was shot and killed in a stolen white Jeep outside of CHOP barricades. What was the narrative that emerged around his death?
So one thing that has been pretty universal in everything we've heard is that CHOP security killed Antonio Mays Jr. Why did they kill Antonio? Well, the justification has been that it was a form of self-defense, that CHOP security saw Antonio in the white Jeep as a sort of threat. Why did they think he was a threat? Well, they said that, protesters on the ground said that he was driving around, shooting, had stolen the Jeep. And then the city has repeated these allegations in its defense in a lawsuit filed by his father 5 years later. So that is kind of the narrative 5 years later that we have been left with, that, for lack of a better term, Antonio Mays was no angel.
When you say CHOP security, who are you referring to?
CHOP security is a loose term, but basically they were a group or groups of people who had appointed themselves as protectors of CHOP. Many of them were armed, and they stood watch at the barricades, kind of scanning for what they perceived to be potential threats.
Okay. Your reporting uncovered new information that contradicts this narrative. What is it, Sydney?
Well, if we look at the allegation that Antonio was shooting, we reviewed videos from the time and looked at city-commissioned video analysis, and it shows that the only gunfire that can be registered on video was aimed at Antonio. That, no visible or audible gunfire is coming from the white Jeep. So this seems to be some sort of miscommunication that happened on the ground. It was a chaotic night. There were multiple cars driving around. Maybe a protester assumed that the white Jeep was the one firing the bullets, but it doesn't hold up under scrutiny. The second allegation is that Antonio was driving, and that is not something that we are certain of at all. Most of his injuries are on the right side of his body, which suggests that they were the side of his body exposed to the passenger side window and door. And then we have two witnesses telling the Seattle Times, or telling attorneys, that Antonio Mays was the passenger. So that's significant as well. And then the third prong of this is that Antonio played some role in stealing the vehicle, but there's no kind of hard evidence to support that either. The person whose vehicle was stolen reported that his attacker had an East African accent, and that is not something that Antonio had.
Okay. And where did this new information come from?
Much of this came from what has been filed in the lawsuit itself. So the city is filing motions and attaching new pieces of evidence. The plaintiffs is filing motions and attaching new pieces of evidence. But what's really interesting about this is that the Seattle Police Department has been totally silent on this case for 5 years, with the exception of saying this is an open and active case. We are still working it. So the only pieces of information we are able to glean have been coming from the court case.
Wow. What does it mean that these narratives don't match up, Sydney, that the video contradicts the narrative?
Well, I think it poses a very uncomfortable truth for both Seattle city officials and the protesters who were there that night. For the city, in its legal defense, it's citing something called the felony bar statute. And this is something that municipalities can invoke in defending themselves from liability. They can say, we are not liable for damages if the person who was harmed was committing a felony at the time. So if the city of Seattle can prove that Antonio was committing a felony, that's one defense from having to pay damages to his father. I think there's this larger ethical, moral question for the protesters, which is, in the 5 years, there's been this narrative that Antonio was posing a threat and the people who killed him were acting out of self-defense. But is that true? Is self-defense justified here?
How is this new information important today? How might this show up in the civil trial? Where might this come up?
Well, we are not entirely sure that there will be a trial. The city has motioned for summary judgment, meaning they have argued that the judge should throw out the case. And they've already won several of those points. So there's still a chance that the judge could throw out the lawsuit. But if this lawsuit moves forward, if this trial moves forward, we are going to hear from witnesses who were there that night who will be explaining what they saw. This evidence will come up. Maybe it will be a full public airing of what everyone actually knows of what happened.
Have you talked with Antonio Mays Sr. about this new information?
I have not talked to him about this new information, but he has maintained from the very beginning in all of my conversations with him that his son was not driving and not shooting.
We know more about the night Antonio Mays died, but there are still so many unknowns, Sydney. What is your take about why there's so much difficulty in solving Antonio's murder?
Yeah, I think there are two big hurdles here. The first is evidence. So Seattle police have said from the hours after the shooting up through the present day that one thing hampering their investigation is the fact that evidence was tampered with. After the two boys in the Jeep were shot, people picked up shell casings and pocketed them and rifled through the Jeep. So that's an issue. At the same time, what we now know from body-worn video filed in the court case is that there was a contingent of police officers who approached the scene of the shot-up Jeep and were told by their incident commander not to secure the crime scene. So Seattle police made a critical decision at the time not to secure the crime scene, and it's not like, 5 years later, the fact that evidence was tampered with was totally out of their control. They did have an opportunity to secure the crime scene at the time. The second thing hampering, I think, the investigation is the circle of people who know who killed Antonio Mays and are protecting the people in their circle.
What happened to Chop after Antonio Mays Jr. was killed?
Antonio's death was also kind of the death knell for Chop. Lorenzo Anderson had been shot and killed 10 days earlier, and after Antonio's death, the city came in and decided, this is it, we're going to shut it down. So a couple of days later, police came in, cleared the area, and Chop was no more. Protests continued on throughout that summer, and people continued to show up at the park, but Chop, the occupied protest as we knew it for 23 days, ceased to exist.
Yet it endures in our national memory, Sydney. What questions do you still want answers to before I let you go?
I want to know what the police know. This killing happened right outside of the East Precinct. One might think that police have access to sources of information that we as investigators or the general public does not. So I'm wondering, why has it taken so long to solve this case? It's been 5 years. As far as we know, there's no active suspects. What information do the police have? What are they waiting on? What do they know? That is my primary kind of train of curiosity. And I'm also curious about what the protesters know and what they don't want to tell us because of the person or persons they're trying to protect.
Seattle Times investigative reporter Sydney Brownstone, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate you listening to Seattle Now. Today's episode was produced by Brooklyn Jamerson Flowers. It was edited by Andy Hurst. Our production team also includes Caroline Chamberlain Gomez, Vaughn Jones, and Paige Browning. Greg Kramer does our theme music. Seattle Now and KUOW Public Radio are members of the NPR network. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you soon.